thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. We will expected to learn a lot. And if anyone is interested in joining the League of Women Voters, please visit our website at lwvvc.org. I would like to introduce our Growth Management Chair, Sarah Lee Morrissey, who so very well organized this event and has put together an expert panel. So thank you all so much again for being here.
All right, thank you, Nancy, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for coming. Let me just start by saying, has anyone attended either Tuesday or Wednesday's community meetings on this same topic? Okay, let me say to each of you and all the rest of you, today you're getting the master class, okay? We are going deep on this subject, and we are going to be a little bit more interactive. Not that those meetings weren't interactive, but we have scheduled this to be a Q&A both during the presentation. We'll have there's so much brain food in this presentation that we're breaking it at certain spots. We'll take a couple of questions during that time. Our team will continue on, and then at the end, again, we'll have opportunity for Q&A. At the very end, Jessica and the team from Taylor Engineering are here for further conversation at our boards, which is very similar, if not exactly similar, to what's been happening at the community meetings. So we're going to have a lot of opportunity for conversation, deep understanding of this material. Because I have to say to you, as someone who's been here in our county for about 40 years, have dealt with some really big issues that require understanding by the masses, and even voter approval by the masses of things. I think this issue, this topic, is one of, if not the most critical issue facing this county in this decade, all right? Our beach, in my opinion, is the most valuable natural as well as economic resource in our county. And so the future of both us as communities, us as a county, and our coast and our beach is pretty important. And so I see this as a kickoff for the county, quite frankly. But make no mistake, I think city involvement, and I think city involvement across our entire county is going to be very important. This should not just rest on our East Side city's shoulders. So I really appreciate that y'all are here and that you are interested in this topic. I want to make sure that those of you who don't feel like you can see the screen, you are welcome to get up. And I know, Kelly, I'm looking at you. I just asked you to move. But I want you to feel comfortable. If you can't see, feel free to move during the time. I know we advertised this to include Suzanne Conscian, Deputy County Manager. Suzanne's had another issue come up. She may be here later in our time together, and if not, we'll do just fine. I'm going to move this over to Jessica Fentress, who is the Coastal Director for Volusia County, and she has a team of experts with her from Taylor Engineering. If you've been to the community meetings, these are the exact same people that are speaking to you both in mass and at the boards, a very impressive group. I am only going to give a brief intro to Jessica and let Jessica take it from there. We, the League, We introduced this issue to our members, and a few of you, Ken, I know you were there, and I appreciate that you came. In April of 2024, we had a hot topic where Jessica and Suzanne and gentlemen from a different engineering group came and kind of talked real broad about just beach erosion and beach management and kind of what should you do or what could you do, and hey, Volusia, kind of like a wake up. This is now the next step. Jessica and her team have been not just spending money, but spending a lot of time analyzing, gathering data, and starting to bring forward important information by which recommendations and next steps come forward. Jessica she's going to hit 10 years with the county in January. And prior to that, she was with the city of Virginia Beach, doing project management work, both with the coast and other engineering things. She has a very strong engineering background, a BS from the University of North Carolina. And then I saw this on the screen last night, and I was like, a BS in mathematical engineering? I like, please don't include data on that for us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Jessica.
My name is Jessica Fentress. I'm your Volusia County Coastal Director, and we are here today to talk about our long-term beach management plan for Volusia County. What many people don't know is that we are one of 2 counties on the east coast of Florida that does not have a beach management plan. That's why after the 22 hurricanes, everybody was calling and saying, why isn't the Army Corps pumping sand immediately onto our beach? We don't have the sand sourcing done. We don't have the permits. We don't have the funding. We don't have that program in place. And who gets sand worse? We had 37 miles of managed beach. We have the North Peninsula, which is a state park on the north, and then we've got Canaveral Seashore, which is a fed park on the south. So 37 miles of beach damage too. In Hurricane Matthew, we took some hits in isolated areas, but in the 22 storms, it literally went from Granada all the way down to Bethune. And it was different. Down in Bethune, we got 4 feet of sand put into Mary McLeod Bethune Beach Park, where we had erosional concerns up in the north end. So I'm going to move in today. I'm going to pass it off to Mr. Marino. He is president of Taylor Engineering. And if you Google Taylor Engineering, they are not from the state of Washington. This is the Taylor Engineering out of Florida. I got called on that yesterday. They all live in Florida, have lived in Florida, know our beaches very well. And I'll pass it off to Jim.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, no, we're not from Washington. So I've had the privilege of being the president of Taylor Engineering the last 14 and a half years. Prior to that, I spent a couple of decades in the Army doing things. So the public life and private life isn't kind of normal to me. So I'm a little bit different. What I need to tell you, so we've had a 31-year relationship, Taylor Engineering. Dr. Taylor started the firm about 40 years ago. We've had a 31-year relationship with Volusia County. So we feel pretty comfortable. I myself have had a house in DeBarry and New Smyrna Beach. Of course, I live in St. Johns County now because that's where the headquarters is, and it made sense for us to move up there. But there's a close sense of servant leadership in our organization. That's really what guides our corporate culture is the concept of servant leadership. We understand it's a privilege, and we're part of the public, and we should serve first. And that's what really guides us. I'd like to believe that that's part of our 31-year relationship with the county. So today, I think the plan still is that we're going to have 3 breaks in this presentation. So, you know, you don't have to remember something that was said 30 or 45 minutes ago. We'll break that up. You ask the questions that you have, and we'll do our best to answer them. Or we'll copy them down, and that'll be the next phase of what it is we work on. So that's it from me. We know it's a privilege to be here, and we take it that way. Again, servant leadership is our model, and that's what guides our culture. But Chris and Wendy, far smarter and better developed than me again. You know, I went to West Point, and they figured I hadn't learned enough, so they sent me to graduate school to the University of Florida. Then they figured I didn't learn enough about coastal engineering. Then they sent me to a research and development assignment for 3.5 years at the Coastal Engineering Research Center, and I think they still don't think I know enough. So we have a bunch of bright folks that are behind them as well. And so we're here really to address your concerns, your questions, and try to come back with what the best solution to what Volusia's challenges are. Okay? I do. So Chris is up first, Wendy's up first. Yeah. Okay. Wendy will be up first. Yeah, you going backwards? So we can, you're going to do it?
Yes.
So we can introduce all their cool education?
Yes. So what have we done since the last time we came out and talked to League of Women Voters in April of 24? We've done a lot. We have started our construction projects. We have initiated this feasibility study. We are doing the economic impact of the beaches, because when we get to the end of this presentation, I'm going to hit it home on why is this important. That's always the end of a presentation. Why should I care about all these fun things you just told me about? It ultimately comes down to brass tacks is dollars, right? Dollars, jobs, our economy. That's always our priority as policymakers. So I'm going to give you a pre-review of our projects we have currently in place, our construction projects, our planned projects. Then we're going to move into the analytical process of our feasibility study. We're all going to open it up for Q&A within the interims. And then at the end, we're going to talk about our economic impact. If you have not yet gotten a copy of the economic impact report, I do have copies on the back table for you to peruse in at your leisure. There is a section on prostitutes in there, so tell me when you find that little hidden nugget. I'll be stoked. So let's talk about what's going on. You've seen it all over the news. We have what's called the North Beach Sand Placement Project, where we are partnering with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we are pumping approximately 750,000 cubic yards of beautiful beach sand onto our beaches. It's sitting right behind Skip White's house, along with the dredging fuel farm. And what we're doing is we're stockpiling that sand, we're letting it dry out, we're mixing it up, we're making it beach compatible, and then we are truck hauling it to the beaches south of Sunglow Pier in Daytona Beach shores. The berm consists of 18 cubic yards per linear foot of per linear foot of shoreline. For awareness of what 18 cubic yards is, that's approximately one normal dump truck. If you have grandkids or young children, the Tonka toys are out, and I would encourage you to go to the North Turn restaurant and watch the Tonka toys come up and down the beach. But if we were doing a full beach nourishment project, instead of 18 cubic yards per linear foot, we would be doing 100 cubic yards per linear foot. So if you happen to have seen the berm that was created, or you live in the area, that was not a beach nourishment project, and that's what I want to get out. That was purely a Band-Aid to replace the sand that was lost from the 22 hurricanes. We lost over 6 million cubic yards of sand from the 22 hurricanes. This one project is just 750,000. It's a snack to the ocean. The project that we did, so just in case you're not familiar, we dredged sand from the Intercoastal Waterway and Ponce de Leon Inlet in the shoals. There's a pipe that runs over the jetty, runs up to just behind Beach Street, and then this entire green area is where we stockpiled sand. That's from about Ocean View in Ponce Inlet all the way down to Beach Street. We are not stockpiling sand south of Beach Street because we just watched about 2 months of significant nor'easter / Imelda / Aaron things happen. And the sand moved from the berms into the offshore or the near shore. So we didn't put sand in this area because we didn't want it right back in the inlet. Truck hauling it north, we have gotten down to about Ocean View. We're pausing until we get to December, and then we're going to start placing the sand south of Beach Street to the Battelle property, which is the southernmost private property. Fun fact, we have the saltiest coastline, so they actually test paint chips there to see how it holds up to the salt, and windows and seals and all kinds of things. Hope to have this project completed. The Army Corps is scheduled to finish their dredging at the end of November, and we are hoping to have all of our sand placed shortly in the new year. Our contractor's local, Halifax, they're great. They've been excellent partners throughout this entire project. That's what it looked like. It was beautiful, right? It's great. It's awesome. Turtles loved it. People loved it. But it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It's gone in the near shore. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. If you talk to Mayor Miller, the private property owners that benefited from this sand placement project throughout Erin, throughout Imelda, throughout that weird funky nor'easter we got in between both of them, the tide didn't hit the seawalls until 1 week before the swell went out. So if they were taking 6 straight weeks of ocean events in this critical area of this, just for reference, Tornita Beach Ramp is right where that light pole is. So that's about the 4100 block of South Atlantic Avenue in Wilbur by the Sea. Some of these properties still don't have seawalls. So they're private properties. And we had a berm that went out to about where the water line was and then sloped down. So it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It provided protection. It put material into what you will later hear as a sand-starved system. We lost 6 million cubic yards. It didn't just go in the near shore. That went in our inlet. That's why we're dredging it. We're going to go into our future projects and you'll see where additional sand is coming from. But it did exactly what it was supposed to do. The second project, Vice Mayor Martin is in the room. New Smyrna Beach is the South Sand Placement Project. We are dredging approximately 550,000 cubic yards of sand from Rattlesnake Island. That's right here. Here's the back end of the ICW. This is Smyrna Dunes Park on the far left of the screen. We did this exact same project in 2006. Those of you who have been here for a while, 2004, we had a significant amount of hurricanes, tore New Smyrna up. We found buried school buses in the dunes because apparently that's how they did it in the 70s. Can't do that today. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this beautiful beach sand that is sitting in a dredge material management area. It came from the channel a couple years ago. It's been tested. We are going to pump that sand down the ICW along the pink line. There is a submerged pipe going across Sapphire Road. For those of you that don't know where Sapphire Road is, that's also Gracie Park. Very popular beach parking approach. We're going to daylight the pipe on the beach at Sapphire Road. And we're going to start placing sand in a similar 18 cubic yard per linear foot template, starting at the north end and working our way south. We're going to discharge the sand, build the beach. As soon as we get a segment of beach built, we're going to lay another pipe on it, discharge the sand. Once that's built, we're going to lay another pipe on it, all the way down to unincorporated New Smyrna. I think the Sandpiper 3100 block area. And we need easements. So if you know anybody who wants an easement, have them contact us. We will be more than happy to help facilitate easements to allow us to provide you with sand. That got a notice to proceed October 1. They have already started working on site prep on the island. We anticipate pipes to show up on Sapphire and the beach in late November. Project should be completed by May 1. May 1 is turtle nesting season, and we will plant kind of in that April timeframe. Here's the big money, sand. This is what we are calling our Shoals to Shore project. Following the hurricanes, we got $82 million in total grant funding from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. That was in response to the calls for assistance from our elected leadership, not only at our local level, but also at our state level, mostly Leak, Wright, Tremont. They were significant in helping us get this. We believe there's about 1.75 million cubic yards of sand. Just for perspective, the North project was 750,000. The South project is 550,000. So this is going to double all of that. This will provide sand for the beaches north of Sunglow, up to about Granada for everybody who signs an easement for us. And then you should have enough material left to do the first beach project. Wherever that beach project ends up being, we haven't defined that because that's what we're working through right now as our beach management plan to identify the first beach project. Even longer term, one of the questions I got was, why isn't the Army Corps pumping all the sand out of the ocean back onto my beach? Well, we didn't have the permits for that. We did a sand source investigation back in 2004, and the leadership in that time of 2006 to 2008 kind of chose not to pursue this. This little pink line right there, you may or may not be able to see it. Hopefully you can see my little laser pointer. That's the 3 mile marker, state waters versus fed. most of our sand source is outside of that pink line. You know what that means? Let's add another couple of years to it. Maybe they can doge the permitting process at the federal level. I would greatly appreciate that. But where we've got a significant amount of sand in there, like around the round of 40 million cubic yards. We've got enough to make our beach no longer in a sand-starved, sand-deficit state, put beach on or put sand onto our beach, and then protect our private properties, our recreation, our tourism, and our habitat. So, coastal background. Yes, sir.
Phase 2 and phase, give a politician a mic. Good job. Phase 2 and phase 3, the easement process. When do we start that, and do we have a cutoff date like we did for phase 1?
So the one thing about easements is you do not want to sign an easement until you think you are very close to placing sand, because what that will do is it will encumber property. And there's you may or may not want to sell. It's no point in encumbering the property. We're not going after permanent easements at this time. We're only going after temporary easements. We are anticipating we can possibly have sand placement associated with the second phase of Inlet Shoals to Shores project in 2027. So I'm going to pass it to Wendy. She is the Volusia County beach expert.
Thank you, Jessica. All right, so to set the stage, we're first going to go over a little bit of history and some terminology about beaches, because we're going to be using these words, so hopefully we can set you up to success for understanding us. A little bit about history and what we've been doing, especially since 2019. So annually, the county has been collecting beach profile data. In a second, we'll go over what a beach profile is, but we send a team of surveyors out, and every year at the start of the summer season, they collect this data. So it is elevation data at intervals of about 1,000 feet along the beach. So this allows us to produce annual monitoring reports. We're looking at this data and saying, you know what, this area is eroding a little more than the previous year. We also look at this after storm. So that's how Jessica knows that the county lost 6 million cubic yards of sand following Hurricanes Ian and Nicole. So some of those reports are available on the coastal webpage. So if you're really interested in looking at that data, please go download them there. Additionally, I do want to mention too that the county does actively manage Ponce de Leon Inlet. So there is an inlet management plan that needs to be upheld, and they receive funds from the state as well. And that's what a lot of these bypassing projects have done. So the dredging right now that's occurring in the inlet and going north of the inlet, that's meeting our goals and objectives that are set in this inlet management plan. So beach terminology, I hope you've all been out there. If not, you're really missing out. In the back of the beach, we have our dune. So typically this is vegetated, or we hope it's vegetated, and this provides your last line of defense on the beach. It's a very, very important feature. Following that, we come to our beach berm. This is the area where the public recreates. This is where you drive in the county. Then we have our intertidal zone. This is where mean high water and mean low water, MHW and MLW. This is the high tide, low tide zone. Sometimes it's wet, sometimes it's not. And then the near shore, where you've seen that North Berm project go into, it's still in the active beach system. So notably, too, storm water levels, they vary. Different storms have different water levels, and those usually exceed that mean high water level. Also, there's king tides, other high water level events. So that will exceed that and oftentimes come up to the berm, and hopefully you have a dune there to help protect you from those high water levels. And touching on our last set of meetings. So back in February, we held our first set of outreach meetings. Again, they were 3 consecutive evenings. And during those meetings, we went over some of the historic beach trends. So what's been happening on the Volusia County beaches, primarily since about 2019? How did the hurricanes impact you here? And we discussed all that. So if you scan the code at the bottom or just go to the county's website, there is a recording from that meeting and that presentation available online. It will also be in our final report. I do want to note, Jessica mentioned there are 37 miles of managed beaches here. Of those 37 miles, the state, FDEP, recognizes 27 of those as critically eroded. And here you can see the definition of what a critically eroded shoreline is. So this is a segment of shoreline where natural processes or human activities have caused or contributed to erosion and recession of the beach or dune system to such a degree that upland development, recreational interest, wildlife habitat, or important cultural resources are threatened or lost. 27 of 37 miles. That is very significant. Additionally, I do want to mention, Jessica will go over this a little bit at the end of the presentation, but during that first set of outreach meetings, we also did a beach user survey. It was great. We've received over 12,000 responses about how your community members like to enjoy the beach and what they want to see for its future. We have another survey that's live, and hopefully we receive just as much feedback about what you want for the beach in the future. So please check that out if you're interested. We'd also be happy to talk about that more. And next, I'm going to pass it to Chris to talk a little bit about our risk assessment.
All right, thank you, Wendy. Next, we will focus on the risk assessment. And some of you I've seen, and I saw some hands raised earlier on attending the meetings the last 2 nights. Some of the slides will look familiar, but we're hoping to take the opportunity today to dig in a little bit more and to discuss some of the factors within the individual communities that we noticed within the risk assessment. And then we also have a bunch of posters in the back for after this presentation is over. We'd love to talk with you if there are any questions that you have or things that might not have been clear. All right, so when we talk about the risk assessment methodology, what we did is we defined vulnerability parameters, and then we used those parameters to develop a community risk index. And we did this by looking at different facets of the existing conditions on a parcel by parcel basis within each community. And then we looked at those parcels within each community to determine average values or the specific condition for that community based on the parcel data, ultimately to derive that community risk index that we'll get to here at the end of this segment. So the first main parameter that we looked at was shoreline encroachment. So this was used to define the distance between the mean high water shoreline that Wendy just mentioned and where that infrastructure was located for that specific parcel. So that's the horizontal buffer between the sea and the infrastructure. That was parameter 1. Parameter 2 was an infrastructure exposure that was looked at in the vertical. So this was a vertical elevation examination, taking the elevation of each of the structure at each parcel and comparing that to a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers statistical water level that was derived in a large study they did. They actually ran over 1,000 synthetic tropical storms and hurricanes through a numerical model that included the storm surge as well as the breaking waves, and then did a statistical analysis to come up with what's the 1% annual chance water level. And they also looked at other return periods as well, but that 1% annual chance you can think of as a 1 in 100 year type event. So this is an elevated water level, and what we did is we compared that water level along the county and with the elevation for the structure on that parcel. And then looking at whether that was within a foot or greater than a foot, we defined an index, and that allowed us to define the infrastructure exposure for each community as the second parameter. The third parameter was the historical erosion rate. For this, we looked at data going back to 2016, so Matthew to present, and along the county, we defined a historical erosion rate for each community using a technique called linear regression. So we took all of the measured data that we had between 2016 and 2024, and then developed the average change in the shoreline position. So this analysis showed that on average, the county shoreline has lost over 8 feet per year of shoreline. In some of the communities, it's over 12 feet, and we can see some of those results when we get into the details here coming up. And then lastly, down at the bottom, there were some other factors that were weighted a little bit lower. So we looked at the presence of armoring, where there's seawalls or not, and the elevation of those seawalls. S-Beach storm response is we were provided some modeling data from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP, that looked at how that shoreline would respond in different sections to different types of storm forcing. So we applied that information as well. And then lastly, there was some community demographics information where the details for that are back on our posters. So the graphic here is trying to convey, we had a horizontal buffer, that's that first parameter, shoreline encroachment. We had a vertical aspect of the vulnerability, that's that infrastructure exposure, number 2. And then not shown labeled, but 3 is that shoreline retreat that was measured since 2016. All right, so getting into a little bit more of the details, what we have on this slide is just an example of how this was done. So you'll notice some of the infrastructure labeled as homes. We have condos also labeled. We also have a road labeled. And then we have this mean high water shoreline position. Oops, hold on, going backwards. Mean high water shoreline position that's labeled as the black line. So looking at each parcel then, we were able to determine the parameters for the vulnerability assessment by looking at the distance between a parcel and that mean high water shoreline, so that defined that horizontal buffer. And then we also knew the elevation of that parcel and compared it to the Army Corps of Engineers statistical water level to provide that elevation buffer parameter for each parcel as well. Lastly, we had the data along the entire county for the shoreline change rate, and then therefore we were able to have all the parameters at that parcel, and then we looked at those across the community to come up with a community risk index that was applied. We did use the best available data, so a lot of the analyses were done with 2024 post-Milton LIDAR data, and that allowed us to have very detailed and current data to develop these analyses. All right, so this table sums up the risk assessment results, and no, your eyes aren't going bad. This is all blurred out so I can walk you through it and help you orient you before you start looking at the specific details within the matrix. So to walk through what we're going to talk about, on the left-hand side, we have the communities from north to south that were evaluated, and then along the top in the blue, oh my goodness, this is touchy. Oh, I did not do that. All right, getting back. There we go. So along the top, we have the parameters that were evaluated within each community. So there's that shoreline encroachment, infrastructure exposure, that historical change rate, and then as I mentioned, armoring, as well as that S-Beach modeling result was also examined. So for each parameter, we assigned a value in that lower left corner there to evaluate the risk. It was either evaluated as low, receiving 1 point, medium with 2, or high with 3 points. So what this means is that the more points you get, the higher the risk that is being assigned for that specific parameter and specific to that community. We recognize that some of the parameters were more important than others. So we had 3 primary parameters that were given a weight of 5. Those were the ones I spoke most about on the previous slides: the shoreline encroachment, infrastructure exposure, or that vertical distance of buffer, and then that historical shoreline change rate. The 2 other parameters, we deemed them secondary parameters. They received a weight of 2. They were worth considering, but they did not receive as much weight as the other 3. So what that allowed us to do then as we worked through was to make our assignments for each parameter in each community based on the data that was there. And as I mentioned, we used current data and had rules on how we made these assignments. So based on that data analysis, what you'll notice is for each community and each parameter, we have a risk rating. That allows us to then, on the column over here, come up with a cumulative risk score where a higher number indicates a higher level of risk, and then we were able to rank each community based on their risk index, as shown there, where The ones indicate the highest risk, so that was Daytona Beach and Daytona Beach Shores, as long as Wilbur by the Sea. And then 3 and 4 were Silver Sands and Methuen Beach at 3, and then New Smyrna Beach South at 4. Now, if we dig in just a little bit, what we'll notice is, we have some parameters like infrastructure exposure. And what we found was that Silver Sands and Methuen Beach had a higher percentage of structures that were within that 1 foot distance, where their structure elevation was close in proximity to that Army Corps of Engineers statistical water level for the storm surge, indicating a more vulnerable infrastructure set within that specific community than any of the other ones. Notice that's the only community that received a score of 3. We have all the data related to the percentage of parcels and kind of how that was calculated back there in the posters that we can dig into after the talk if you would like. And then another example would be the historical shoreline change rate. As I mentioned, countywide, the average was 8.5 feet per year since 2016, based on that regression analysis. However, several of the communities had rates that were over 10 feet per year, and those communities with the highest rates had the highest level of risk associated with those. And it's similar across the other parameters. You can see there is variation across, but the ones that ended up with the highest risk score, therefore the highest ranked risk, you'll notice we have 4 out of 5 highs and 3 out of high 5s for those specific communities. Next, Wendy will take over. Oh, questions. All right. All right, we're gonna, if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic, and that way it will end up on the recording.
All right.
Thank you. First, there's a water tower, in case anybody wants to refill. It just came in, so that wasn't my question. I want to make sure you all know that, because we're here for a while. I asked this last night, and it took Nicole a little while to get me to understand the answer, which I do understand, but I think it's worth asking. Infrastructure exposure. I was really surprised to see the ranking of Wilbur by the Sea. That it had a low, and then I think on another graphic you have it shows 0 properties. And yet, what's in my mind is after Ian, we were seeing visuals of houses that literally were in Wilbur falling into the ocean. So could you explain that kind of perceived differential?
Thank you, Sarah Lee. I'd be happy to explain that. So in Wilbur, yes, we saw a lot of erosion, especially after Hurricanes Ian and Nicole. That would really be represented by that shoreline encroachment. So the horizontal distance between the mean high water location and the actual infrastructure. That horizontal distance was quite small. However, the infrastructure there is actually quite high. That's why you were seeing those very large sand scarps. So the infrastructure sits up high. However, the buffer between infrastructure and the ocean is quite narrow. So that's why their rating for infrastructure exposure is low, because it sits high. However, if you look at the shoreline encroachment, that's high. So it's balancing out there. We recognize that both are important, but they're separated into 2 separate factors.
And is there not also an implication that that particular storm event was different than what the Army Corps study says the elevation is?
Well, I think maybe continuing on with Wendy's responses, the damage was mostly related to the erosion, and the erosion was worse there because the shoreline encroachment value, there was less of a sand buffer there, so the erosion got back to reach the foundations and to undermine houses and cause damage, as opposed to the elevation of the storm surge being so high that the water was coming right into, say, the second story of the building, which would be the damage caused if it was purely based on the elevation of the water from the storm surge. All right.
Thank you. When you talk about the infrastructure, you're talking about what specifically?
So infrastructure would be either a household,
Household,
the
okay.
condominiums, a road,
A
any
road.
critical infrastructure,
So
yes.
that's what I was getting to, because there, specifically in Wilbur, in my district, there was concern over 3 properties, and I'm not going to get too specific, but there were concern over those 3 properties. The erosion that we saw dismantled the houses completely. It didn't make it to the road, but there were concerns about the fact that the erosion would go back into the road and therefore tear up A1A, which we could probably repair a lot cheaper than it would be to put a seawall there. Thank you. So, and I've said it so many times, I forgot it. But anyways, so that's what you're referring to mostly with that. Okay.
Correct. And the road is quite important too, because that's a critical evacuation route, so.
Exactly. Yeah, we
Very
didn't see
important.
that erosion go back that far. I mean, it stayed off, and since that time, we've seen more sand buildup. Yes, by their own design, but also from the natural accretion of sand coming back. Okay.
I know this is a little out of line, but I happen to have been driving down from Flagler the other day along the ocean, and of course, most of the road, I mean, it's like a one-way street. Are they doing as much work, or is that affecting your work in a positive or unpositive way?
Yes, so that project that's going on, I believe you're referring to the FDOT project that's protecting A1A. So they've installed a reinforced dune system there. So it has that final portion of protection, protecting the road and that critical evacuation route. In front of that, they're also putting sand. So that should help benefit the county because that sand is now actively in the system. So that's a plus. However, it is a small amount of sand.
So let me just take that question. So Flagler, the rest of the answer to that is just recently they've asked us to take a look at their entire shoreline, just as we've done with you, because they have a brand new federal shore protection project that's authorized and just got their first project done about a year or so ago. It was completed. Really just the city of Flagler Beach is what was covered, but that leaves the rest of the county open to what about us. So we understand the connection of all these. I think it's good that they have their Flagler Beach project in. So if we get all of Volusia done, because again, once these beach nourishment projects are done, if a beach nourishment project is what you want, if that material is sticking out 100 yards further into the ocean than the rest of the adjacent beaches, the physics of the waves, the energy that's in the waves, is to take that material first because that's what it gets to first. I mean, it is what it is. So they are linked together. It's a great question of what are my neighbors doing? So we can talk about what Volusia has asked for and what you want to do, but it's really important to make sure your neighbors are sort of in line. So it's important that we work together.
Kind of along the same lines of what Mara brought up and what you were just talking about. And on that table there, you showed Ormond by the Sea. I think for the infrastructure exposure is low, but in Ormond by the Sea, that's a part of A1A where DOT is working, a 1 mile portion there. And I mean, it is only 1 mile. I don't know what the stretch is for, you said 1,000 feet?
Yes, each R monument is about 1,000 feet.
So that, or that stretch for Ormond by the Sea then, I mean, so that's a mile that seawall DOT is putting in there. So there is an infrastructure exposure there, a pretty critical one. And I think, you said you were looking at it, did all that sand get washed away that they put in Ormond by the Sea in front of the wall, do you know?
Yes, and I know they've already brought some sand back too and replenished that.
What the gentleman there, Bill, I think was just talking about, I'm north of that wall, and so we're in an area where really there is no infrastructure exposure, and it does show that the risk score is low because the shoreline encroachment was low and the historical shoreline change rate is low. And it really concerns me about what's going to happen. I think I've spoken to a few people here about it. You know, just north of that wall and just south of that wall is natural dune. And how is that going to be protected in your plan? Or will it be? Maybe it's too much to ask now, but will it be protected, like monitored to make sure it doesn't keep eroding so that those two walls that are about 3 miles apart don't end up being one wall?
Yeah, so this year we're going to include that wall has now been constructed in our annual beach monitoring plan. So the county goes out, we collect that data and analyze it. So that will be included in our monitoring. And then also I know the state is looking at North Peninsula State Park and doing a project in the park. So they're doing something to the north, to the south. Hopefully that will be recognized in this plan.
So if you really want to nerd out, and I'm talking about really nerd out, we have all of our profile monitoring plans posted online. They're thrilling. If you want them, find me. I'll send you the link to them, but they are publicly available. The ones following the 22 storms were the most interesting. But yes.
All right, yes, thanks for that great discussion. And what we'll move next to is the next step, which was the looking at shoreline alternatives. So we're going to go through this part of the analysis. That's all those posters on that side of the room over there that will have even a bit more detail about what we're going to talk during the presentation. And then as we get through this phase, we'll pause again and have another opportunity for some questions that anybody has related to this topic. So for the shoreline alternatives analysis, what we did is we investigated beach management alternatives and their applicability to the shoreline or to the county's shoreline reaches. So right in the middle there, you'll notice we evaluated 10 different alternatives. And what we'll do in the next series of slides is go through each one of the alternatives and talk in pretty good detail about specific aspects of each of those alternatives. And then as we work through, after I pass it to Wendy, we're going to get to the evaluation of these alternatives for each community and then culminate with some preliminary recommendations that are also on that last poster over there. So these shoreline alternatives varied quite a bit, and we wanted that. We wanted to look at a diverse set of potential alternatives to help the county, recognizing that different communities might have different solutions to the challenges that they're facing based on the different features. And we know, like has been mentioned, the sand is different in Ormond than it is, in the southern part of the county. There's different aspects. The berm height's different. There's a dune, there's not a dune. So that was all taken into consideration and also helped us develop the different alternatives that we looked at. So importantly, we're going to talk them going from an onshore solution and then finishing at solutions that are further offshore. So as I go through these, it's not in any particular order of importance or ranking at this point. It is just on an onshore to offshore basis of where they would occur generally. And then also, we're going to talk about some benefits and drawbacks. And just as I talk through those, the number of those shown on the slide or the lack of a number doesn't make an alternative better or worse. It really depends on the suitability of the alternative and meeting the goals and objectives that were defined by the county, and then those objectives were given different weights. Wendy will get into that in a little bit more detail. So I don't want you to think just because one has more benefits listed that means it's just the end all and be all and better than the other ones. And then lastly, alternatives may be combined. So it's not uncommon for an area to have maybe a beach nourishment project that then has an erosional hotspot or a certain feature where maybe there's some wave focusing or there's a certain bend in the shoreline that requires some maybe some breakwaters or an offshore reef or some other component to really make the management of that stretch of shoreline work well. So just because we're talking about a specific alternative doesn't mean that there can't be combinations of alternatives ultimately that are developed when we think about how to actively and well manage the shoreline along the county. All right, and then I've already kind of said it, but you can learn more at the posters. All right, So the first alternative that we'll talk about is the no action alternative. So this is the do nothing approach. So the community and decision makers would decide to let nature take its course. So this is the primary function of this would be to allow natural dynamics to proceed without intervention. And it's common within these types of alternatives analysis. The one option of doing something is doing nothing, and that happens to be here. So if we were to think of a benefit, there's minimal environmental disruption due to there's no construction on the beach and no impact that way. And there's also no direct cost. But there's an important caveat there where short-term benefits from taking no action and that no cost aspect of that may create long-term risks and require future emergency features and measures that could be quite costly. So it's, when we think about a long-range plan, this idea of no direct cost, that's a no direct initial cost, but it is a reality that there is no cost initially. When we look at the drawbacks, point out the high risk potential for increased coastal erosion and inundation that could potentially lead to loss of infrastructure based on the conditions within the county. All right, moving next. Structural relocation. So this also occurs up at the location of the different infrastructure, and it's relocating structures inland and restoring the beach system to its natural state. So this can be seen by, in some ways as a drastic measure. You're taking the infrastructure and removing it out of harm's way. So this is done on a structure by structure basis, but in order for it to be meaningful, you would need to do it with many structures, and that leads to some of the challenges that would be faced in implementing this on a large scale. So the benefits are you'd have reduced damages and risk of life from elevated water levels and storms. And the primary purpose of this specific alternative is to reduce the risk and to protect upland infrastructure. Drawbacks could be a disruption to the local economy and also leading to accessibility and lifestyle disruptions, certainly for the people that are being moved or the houses within the community that end up being relocated. The important note here, once again, when we think about doing this at the community scale, relocating structures on a large scale necessitates new infrastructure to sustain those new communities, even having a place to move them, which isn't the easiest when you have a lot of development already in place. All right, floodproofing and structural elevation. So these are solutions to protect from flooding, including the use of flood barriers, raising the grade potentially, or elevating structures on piles. So the primary function for this alternative is to implement both structural and non-structural techniques to protect against flooding. So the idea here is to either elevate the structure or maybe have some type of technique to create a wall around certain structures, or think of a small little levee or something like that. So the benefits here are reduced damages and risk of life from elevated water levels, similar to the idea of removing the structures. Here, instead of removing it away from the beach, you're trying to remove it upward out of that flood zone. There's drawbacks associated with it. Accessibility to the houses. If you're elevated up, 12, 14 feet, then you got to get up 12 or 14 feet and down every time you're entering that structure. So there's aspects related to that. And this is another one that is, within the note, highly feasible at the individual homeowner level, but to move the needle on a community-wide basis takes a lot of buy-in, a lot of effort, and that's one of the considerations that went into the scoring of this alternative. All right, next we'll get to seawalls. So a seawall is a wall installed at the landward edge of the beach, parallel to the shore, and designed to protect upland infrastructure. I would think most of you are familiar with seawalls. There are, quite a few examples of different types of seawalls and their different techniques for construction, as well as different elevations along the Volusia County shoreline. As noted there, the primary function here is to protect upland infrastructure. And they do a very good job of protecting upland infrastructure. They can also fail if they're not designed properly or if they're not maintained. So there's that aspect to it as well. So when we look at benefits versus drawbacks, benefits, primary purpose, protecting upland infrastructure, they can do that. They reduce damages and risk of life from elevated water levels. And while it doesn't say require no maintenance, it's minimal maintenance. It's something where if you design it well and build it well, then it's going to be there for, quite a bit of time before you'd think about having to replace it. Drawbacks, we see there's several listed. Adjacent erosion due to wave reflection or wave refraction is common and may negatively impact shorelines. So ideally with a seawall, what you want that is you want that located outside of the active surf zone. As soon as your seawall is being impacted by either high tides or elevated water levels that frequently occur during nor'easters or even minor storms, that uprush of wave energy that typically occurs on a sloping beach and gravity kind of slows it down and it peters out. It can drop sand and then, there's an undertow that goes back down. That's a natural process where on a well-functioning beach where you have a dune and a berm, that beach can have sand moved away during a storm and moved back onshore during non-storm events. When you have a seawall at the end of your beach that's being impacted by the water, what happens is all that energy runs right into a vertical wall, and all that energy turns into turbulence. It kind of kicks up, and it's going to grab that sand, and then gravity is going to take that sand and water and move it back down. So an exposed seawall that's in the active surf zone actually causes more erosion than if that seawall wasn't there. So what you want to have with your seawall is you want that outside of the active water level. And the way to do that is to, if you have one in place, you need that sand buffer. So Jacksonville is actually a good example where we're from. The city of Jacksonville and Jacksonville Beach actually has a seawall at the end of the beach. You just would never know it was there unless you were back in Jacksonville Beach in the late 70s when there was no beach and it was rocks. And the way to get out to surf and stuff was to jump off the rocks and, go into the water. There was actually no beach. There was a seawall there that was constructed because the infrastructure that was built right on the dune started having storm damages. And if we go back even further, the reason those houses were built on the dune was because in the 20s, 30s, 40s, they actually drove up and down Jacksonville Beach. There was even car races like down here in Volusia County in Jacksonville. Then what they did is they dredged the St. Johns River. Its natural depth was, say, 10 to 15 feet. When they wanted to have the port and the infrastructure there, they dredged the channel to over 30 feet. They put in 2-mile-long jetties, and they cut off the sand supply to Jacksonville Beach. So in the decades after that, each storm without the sand supply came in, and each one, took a little chunk out of the beach. There was erosion, erosion, and erosion. So the people that built on the dune and thought they had this great wide beach, all of a sudden it got closer and closer and closer until they said to protect our properties, we need to put in a seawall. And they did. The erosion kept happening. The water came right up to the seawall. They dumped rocks. There's pictures of like washing machines similar to the school bus that was found. I mean, they did some interesting things back then. But what ended up happening was there was no beach whatsoever, and they had their seawall. What Jacksonville was able to do, because it's a federal navigation channel related to the St. Johns River, is they were able to get a federal shore protection project. So now there's a 10-mile beach nourishment project that's been in place since the late 70s, and they nourish that beach every 6 to 8 years. So if you go up and look at the Jacksonville beach, you'd say, wow, this is a there's a nice dune, it's vegetated, there's a nice, some cases 80 to 100 feet before you get to the water level. You wouldn't even know that there's a seawall buried back in that dune. And that's the best place for a seawall, the last line of defense. And if there's a major catastrophic storm, or let's say 3 or 4 years of just, unusual storm activity, it's going to be there to protect your infrastructure. But as soon as it gets exposed to the water column frequently, those high tides or those elevated water levels during frequent storms, now you have a problem where that seawall is actually deflating your beach and not going to help in an overall idea of meeting some of the community's goals of being able to recreate on the beach. I see you have a question. Is it possible to wait till we're done? Okay. Is that all right? We wait till, or we can, Jessica says, let's do it. All right.
Okay, so Jessica's very familiar with it. So in Daytona Beach Shores, we more or less required people to do a seawall. They had to go through DEP with certain specifications. Sometimes it didn't work. They told them how tall, how deep, everything. Did we not do them a service by requiring the seawalls to be replaced? So if you had an existing seawall and it was damaged in Daytona Beach Shores, we had 127 seawalls that failed. Again, requiring them to put them back up like for like. Did we not do them a favor?
So this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because if you can imagine a shoreline where every other property had a seawall, then now what you've done is you've created gaps in the seawalls, where one of the spots where seawalls are most vulnerable is when they get flanked in the middle. So if you have a situation where it's a patchwork of seawalls, it creates its own set of problems with flanking and erosion in kind of the weak spots, because as Jim mentioned, is that as those waves come in, they're going to kind of eat at whatever they can eat at to, reduce their energy. So those gaps in the seawalls, can cause their own problems. And that's, it's one of those things where once you've built the first few, then you have different decisions to make than if it was all a natural dune, or if it was like one property and it was just one continuous seawall. That would be the strongest situation. But individual property owners are going to build their own seawalls, so they connect them together, and it looks like you're.
You understand what we did. Did we do something wrong?
No, so where you were at following the 22 storms is you had condos, high-rise condos, and you also had single-family homes that were declared unsafe structures and people could not occupy them. You were in what we call a critical state. You were having a heart attack on the table and you need something to keep you alive. That's where you're at right now. The state of Florida Department of Environmental Protection regulates seawalls, which we've all come to realize following the 22 hurricanes. They have a clause in their coastal construction control line program that if you have a planned sand placement project or a nourishment program, or for any reason the sand is coming to your beach within about 9 months, they will not approve a seawall. We didn't have that. You are at a critical nature. Once we get through our beach management plan and each community determines what their solution's going to be, then it may be up to the cities, and maybe you refine your building codes and your zoning setbacks and your land development codes to match your vision.
Would there ever be a time that we would take down those existing steamboats?
I would never recommend that.
Right. So, yes, thank you for the question. And the idea of having them as that last line of defense is the reason why not to pull them out unless they're deteriorating to such a point where they're putting debris on the beach or, something like that. But otherwise, combined, as I mentioned, there can be combinations of solutions, but having that seawall, if it's already there, combined with a beach nourishment program that has a dune that's vegetated, and Wendy showed the profile picture with the berm sloping down, can be, a very nice situation to have, because you have that insurance policy of if it was a superstorm, it's going to protect the infrastructure. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I did have one more question. Obviously, the dynamic of the Daytona Beach Shores area with all the condos being contingent with each other, and then some areas as you go back, and I'm going to go back to Wilbur by the Sea, areas that are more residential, just single family homes, the benefits of returns on those seawalls are there? I mean, because I guess I look at it from a layman's term or perspective that I see a wall and they require a return if the property adjacent to it does not have a seawall, but all I see is water encroaching around it and coming back and eroding the sand that is placed behind the seawall. And I know there's a scientific way, and I just don't understand it. So,
Wendy, do you want to? Go ahead.
So you ask on the return on investment. What we come back to, the return on the seawall, yes, I'll give that to Wendy.
So those return walls are quite important, because if they weren't there and the water gets right away, then it will most likely fail, and that will be catastrophic. So that at least provides a little bit more time. Yeah. Ideally, the returns are long enough that the water won't get around. But again, it's hard to control nature, especially when you're in such a vulnerable situation. So those are very important features, and they exactly better if you had nothing. So.
Right. And then just a little nuance to that, though, is when you put that, your seawall and you put your return wall in, it does provide a vertical surface for when the wave energy gets up that high to hit that wall and reflect to the adjacent properties. So that's another situation where, a property owner, could affect the adjacent property owner if that. So when you, all right.
Yeah, so great questions. So I always get to step in when it has nothing to do with engineering. So last year and a half, Chris and I actually did expert witness testimony for a community in Flagler County. They had 12 neighbors wanted to put in a seawall in accordance with the DEP's newest rules. There was a 6-foot easement between two of the properties, mostly in the middle. They refused to have the seawall, and the design had to be changed to leave a 6-foot gap in the seawall because that person was against. We actually don't know what was going through that person's mind. So we actually had them redesign, or our recommendation to them was to redesign the seawall for return walls, which it really depends on the height and the rest. And so that's the engineering, the math part. So it's about 25 to 50 feet. It really depends on what your flanking was. So I think what they ended up doing here was, because it was only a 6-foot gap, believe it or not, they had 25-foot return walls, and I think on the ends they were a little bit longer, 30 or so, where that 12-home community just left. So while we're presenting what we believe are decent engineering choices for you, the other part of this, unfortunately, is the legal part of we have to follow the rules, and who would believe that that rule would endanger everyone else, but we can only control what we can control. And so I don't know if that was a great answer to your question, but
Right. So
we recommended that the wall be continuous. And then we had to defend that and defend the DEP's ruling based on science. So fortunately, the judge said, I agree, and that was good enough for all of us.
I don't know who's here from Wilbur by the Sea, but I'm 4 buildings north of Wilbur by the Sea in the last part of Daytona Beach Shores. So I'm very, very familiar with what's going on in Wilbur by the Sea. And it's a hodgepodge, especially now with the berms in, it's even worse because they didn't connect anything with what already was there. And if you've looked closely, you see these ravine-like things where the berm ends and it just goes down and forms a gully. Fortunately, now it didn't get all the way up to there, but some of the people have a seawall, some of the people don't have a seawall, some of the people are this far away from the beach, some people are that far away from the beach. It's literally a mess from what I can see, realistically. And it looks terrible too. There's no continuity or anything with it. I don't know what they're going to do about that, but the company who put in those berms needs to be sued because they did a disastrous job. And where I am, 4 of us have handicap ramps, and they wouldn't even fill those in. They said they didn't have the manpower or the machinery to be able to go under there. So naturally, our stuff just got washed away. And I said, well, what's going to happen when it goes over the berm and into underneath my ramp? Well, it'll percolate, is what he said. So, basically, fortunately, the 6 weeks of waves made it so that it took it all away and it could go back down. But I mean, and it's hitting our seawall. But basically, it's just when the neighbors don't all do the same, where they don't do it properly, then it can have terrible ramifications.
Yes, and we recognize that and consistently recommend a unified solution. And hopefully that's where this plan will get us to, is a unified, larger scale solution to implement throughout the county's communities. So I think at this time we're going to keep working through our alternatives, and then we can discuss more afterwards.
Once again, thanks for the great discussion. We'll have some time for questions at the end of this segment as well. So I think we got on seawalls. We will move on to revetments. So revetments are a series of rock structures placed parallel to the beach designed to dissipate the wave energy. So their primary function is to decrease wave energy during increased water level. So we can think of a revetment as a seawall, but instead of being vertical, it's a rock structure that is then going to have a slope, and so then take up a larger footprint along the beach. And since it's porous, when that wave energy comes up, instead of hitting a vertical wall that's solid like a seawall, the wave energy can dissipate into those rocks, and it does not cause the degree of erosion that can occur right at the base of a seawall when it's exposed. In an ideal case, you would have some sort of sand buffer in front of this. You wouldn't want it exposed at all times, but it does have the benefit of decreasing the wave energy that would be impacting the shoreline. From the drawbacks, if the system is sand starved, like we have here in Volusia County, the beach may not accrete in front of it, so you would just have this continuous case of there's just a rock, basically a rock wall that the water level is going to come up to. It's not adding anything to increase the recreational opportunities on the beach. And it does provide limited storm protection. So depending on the size of the rocks and how robustly it's designed, that all relates to the cost of it. Then during storms and really elevated water levels, it's going to have a varying amount of storm protection provided by a revetment. All right, beach nourishment. This is the placement of sand along the beach, including the dune and the berm and the nearshore areas to extend the beach seaward. The primary function here is to add sediment to the system to reduce risk and increase recreation. So as shown in the picture, if you see like the lighter color sand, the idea is to increase the robustness of the dune or create a dune, and then going back, increase the width of the beach berm, and then that's going to extend out even to areas you can't see because they're in the near shore zone. So the benefits, as you can see here, there's quite a few. Importantly, it does add sand to the system. It benefits by extending the adjacent shoreline with the sand moved ultimately not only cross shore but long shore. So at the end of these projects, communities that aren't nourished can also receive benefits due to the natural longshore sediment transport processes that can happen. They decrease wave energy impacting the pre-project shoreline, and that reduction in wave energy helps protect the upland infrastructure. So the natural process of these beaches would be during a storm, there could be erosion of the berm, or during a severe storm, even up to the edge of the dune, that sand moves offshore, creating bars. Those bars trip the wave energy, so there's less wave energy running up and then further impacting the beach. And then after the storm, when you have a period of lower waves, longer period waves, kind of calm conditions, that beach bar will weld back onto your berm and then ultimately up to the higher parts of the berm. And then when we have wind processes, it can even build your dune. The problem that we have is that the erosion from a storm can occur over 6 hours or maybe even 6 days for the case of a nor'easter that's going to, churn up the beach over several high tides. The recovery process can take weeks to months, or in the case of building a dune through wind, that can take, on the many months up to years. One thing that Florida's East Coast has experienced over the last several years is just a lot of storm activity with not a lot of time for beach recovery. So what happens is the beach is in an eroded state before it can recover. The next set of elevated water levels and waves happens, which just takes another slug of sand and moving it offshore. And unlike the period between 2004 and 2016, when we had no major storms, we had the longest period without a landfalling storm in Florida's history, going back as far as they can, measure. The last several years have been very active, not only with the hurricanes, but especially with the low pressure systems and nor'easters that have really caused a lot of erosion. So that was a little bit of a side there maybe. But importantly, having enough sand in the system to be able to move offshore during the storms and back onshore is critical. And right now, Volusia County, as we've mentioned, is in a sand-starved condition, over 6 million cubic yards lost just during the 2022 hurricane season. So this is one of the two alternatives that gets sand back into the system to allow those natural processes to occur. The other things that we have is listed there, increased dune resilience. It provides habitat. So we know sea turtle nesting, shorebird nesting, things like that aren't going to happen on a beach with a seawall that's very deflated and is wet during high tide. There's no opportunity for nesting of either the turtles or successful nesting of either the turtles or the birds. And then it provides recreation opportunity, whether that is walking on the beach, sunbathing, or driving, which we know is important. This is one of the aspects, or the main aspect, that will really provide a very large and immediate increase to that recreational opportunity on the beach. Drawbacks, increased maintenance may be required over other alternatives. So this is known as sacrificial sand. It is not going to be there forever. It will stay in the system generally, but your beach berm will move back over time as it spreads longshore and equilibrates in the cross shore. So there's a periodic renourishment interval that's assigned to these projects. Usually most large projects, it's say 5 to 8 years is the nourishment interval, but that's going to be dependent on the storm activity. In some cases it's longer, in some cases it's shorter. And the other thing that's important is usually there's a larger initial project volume to fill in the design template along the shoreline. And then 5 to 8 years later, there's certain spots that really need to be renourished. There's other spots that don't, so the renourishments typically aren't as large as the initial nourishment for the project. Another thing to note, this has been Florida's preferred management strategy going back a few decades now. If you 70s, 80s, seawalls were kind of the thing. And then what they realized is those seawalls were removing the recreational beach, which was why people were, coming to Florida and like to have that aspect. So beach nourishment projects are quite common in Florida. All right, groins. So what a groin is a rock structure that is perpendicular to the shore, intended to slow longshore sand transport. So that's the sand along the beach. And usually they're done in a series of multiple groins called a groin field. It's not very common to just see a single groin. So their primary function is to reduce erosion along the shoreline. And I want to point out the difference between a groin and a jetty. You may have heard of jetties before. So jetties occur at inlets. They're usually much larger. They're used to control the location of that inlet and also to control the flow of water, or to modify the flow of water through the inlet. So a groin is a smaller structure, usually done in a series along a more straight, continuous section of beach. And some of you, I've heard some people mention they're from New Jersey. Those people are probably quite familiar with groins. They have been used up there for a while. So they can lead to sand accumulation in the vicinity of the groins. But the only time you're going to have accumulation of sand is if there's enough sand to be moving around. In Volusia County's current situation, there's not a lot of sand to move around, and any sand that gets trapped on one side of the groin is just robbing that sand that would be moving along shore, and you're going to have an erosive signal on the other side of that structure. So you'd end up with a scallop shoreline, which is usually why they're put in a series. So that's, I guess I got to the drawbacks there. Adjacent erosion due to wave reflection. Wave refraction is common, and negatively impacts the adjacent shorelines. And if the system is sand-starved, there's really no beach to accrete around these. So in some locations, they have a growing field and then they fill that growing field with sand. So it's one of those combination solutions. But when we think about Volusia County's objectives, a good part of the recreational component is that driving. Trying to drive on a beach with groins is not something that's going to happen. So once again, that gets back to the looking at on a community-by-community basis, developing and tailoring solutions that are specific to what Volusia County wants in the individual communities is what we're working to do here. The other thing that is important with groins is, once again, this gets back to the scaling on a community-wide nature. This is going to be hard to implement, but maybe there's a small pocket somewhere with the specific features and a couple groins might help shore up the shoreline at the end of a littoral system, which is, near an inlet or near some other feature, a change in the shoreline orientation. So we're not saying that they're never appropriate, but we're evaluating whether they're appropriate for the conditions we have in the communities here. Next, nearshore sand placement. So this is sand placed in the nearshore for wave action to move it onshore. The primary function is to add sediment to the system to reduce risk. You'll see this little blob right there. So that is below the water line, and it's like having a beach nourishment project, but instead of placing the sand on the dry beach, you're placing it in 5 to 20 feet of water and then allowing nature to move that sand around, either forming bars or in some cases that sand moves onshore, increases your berm width, provides that storm protection and recreation. The problem is you're really letting nature and what happens after you place it dictate the benefits that you're going to receive and where they're going to be. Because in some cases, if you place the sand and you don't have the right conditions for long enough for that sand to move all the way onshore, you might not get a recreational benefit from that sand. You have improved your storm protection, you've increased sediment moving into the system, but you're not going to then necessarily meet some of the goals of having that recreational space guaranteed. So benefits, add sands to the system, decrease wave energy impacting the shore and upland infrastructure, but its efficacy is dependent on the placement depth and then the wave conditions afterwards to where that sand ultimately ends up. All right, breakwaters. So here we have a structural solution, which is a series of nearshore rock structures designed to break wave energy and to potentially encourage sediment accretion near those structures if there's enough sediment moving around. The primary function is to decrease wave energy impacting the shoreline, and when it decreases that wave energy, so the waves coming from offshore will hit the shallower depth caused by the breakwater, and they will break here instead of breaking on the beach. So you end up with what we call a shadow zone of decreased wave energy. And here, that decreased wave energy area can have sand accumulate, but in a case like we're at right now in Volusia County where there's not a lot of sand moving around, if sand accumulates there, it's going to have an erosive signal, usually in a shore just updrift. Oh dear, did it again. All right, I'm not going to use the laser pointer anymore. So either updrift or downdrift, you're going to have erosive signals because there's not a lot of sand moving around. The other aspect of these is that they're very expensive. So if you're placing these out in 10 or 20 feet of water, and it's going to need to be very large rocks so that when they have hurricane type waves that can occur out there and the rocks aren't moving around, you have a stable structure, you need very large rocks. And then if you're going to have that to go up in the water column enough to meaningfully reduce the wave energy, they need to have a very wide footprint because they're going to have slopes on the sides. So to have these as a community-wide solution would be very expensive. It'd take a lot of resources, but they could be implemented once again as one of those combined solutions, and they've done this in South Florida where you have an erosional hotspot. There's a focusing of wave energy in a certain area on the beach. You put these out there just in that small area, maybe 2 or 3 structures, but not as a community-wide solution to implement over miles of coast. Right, and then nearshore artificial reefs. This is our last one. So this is a series of components intended to enhance biodiversity, dissipate waves and potentially encourage sediment accretion. The primary function is related to habitat. So these structures are, think of maybe like smaller breakwaters. They're placed in the near shore. They're submerged. They have a lot of relief to them. Sometimes you may have heard of things called like reef balls. They're the little, almost like circular shapes with holes in them. You could have fish or other, organisms that are going to be either on them or swimming around them. Oftentimes they're put parallel to the shoreline in rows, such as shown in the drawing, and you can see this is that idea of a reef ball with the little holes in it. And the benefits are they can have some level of decreased wave energy, but usually they sit pretty low in the water column, so the amount of wave energy decrease they present is relatively small, and they have a relatively small impact then on the storm protection as well as the shoreline effects behind them, and they don't do anything really to deal with the recreational aspects on the beach. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Wendy. Do you want to stop for questions?
Yeah, before we go into our ranking of each one of these alternatives, we'll take a break and see if anyone has any questions about these 10 alternatives. Next, we'll get ranking and preliminary recommendations. So,
when we say sand-starved, and I think that's all of Volusia County beaches, what does that starvation do for surfing, for driving on the beach? Like, I bicycle on the beach, and I know New Smyrna's is getting way too soft to do that. So I'm wondering about the sand placement, the sand starvation, and how that impacts the recreational side.
Right. So what the beach surveys have shown, and we've mentioned there's a countywide program, it takes them yearly, so we can look at the shoreline position as well as things underwater, where the bars are, how big they are, and things. What we noticed was at that 2022 hurricane season caused a loss of around 6 million cubic yards of material eroded outside of the profiles that were seen before that. So when we're talking sand-starved, there's not a lot of sand kind of in the system and moving and kind of having elevated berms or dune features where when storms come, they can move the sediment around. I understand the idea of the compaction of the sand and being able to drive on it or even bike on it, yes. And that relates to some of that cross-shore transport processes that we've had. When the sand moves back onshore, it's not really compacted, it's a little bit looser. Volusia, or Daytona Beach is known for having a very flat profile, the driving on the beach. It's different if you go up to Ormond, where the geology is different. You have the more cinnamon-colored orange rocks related to the rock outcroppings up there. The waves cause that to break up, and that's one of the aspects of just the overall geology related to it. But when it's the sand-starved, it's the amount of erosion that's happened recently and the amount of material that's moving in the system, in the active profile, to accrete and reform the berm and the dune features that you'd want in kind of a healthy beach system. And did you want to add anything to that, Wendy? Or do you think that covered it?
I think that covered it quite well. And notably, following Hurricanes Ian and Nicole, some of those profiles that we were seeing, the beach berm where you do recreate, that decrease in elevation was 10 feet or greater. So that is a huge decrease and a very large amount of sand.
Hi, I actually had two questions. So the first question is, which solution would be coquina rock? What would that fall under? Placing coquina rock in place of a seawall.
So I would think that would be placed up near where the dune and the seawalls would be.
Yes.
So that would be closest to a rock revetment, where the rocks would be the coquina rock instead of granite or some type of other rock material.
Okay, and we did have 31 homes between Frank Rendon Park and St. Kitts Condo that elected to do that and petitioned DEP. Took a lot of approval and a lot of time because that's not something they wanted to do, and then they put sand on top of it. I'll reach back out to Jessica to see how successful that was. And then my next question is the breakwaters and the artificial reefs. All of the alternates that you have here, alternatives, are these all approved? So the breakwaters with DEP, is that an approved? All of these are approved that it could be.
All 10, one of the first criteria is it viable to be permitted? Because if it can't be permitted, it can't be constructed, and then it's not a viable solution. So that doesn't mean that they all have the same level of rigor and cost to get the permit, but they all have been permitted in Florida and are potentially solutions for the county.
Okay. Do you happen to know offhand where like a breakwater, because I do like both of those, the breakwaters and the artificial reefs, are those used anywhere on our coast in Florida?
Yes. So they have been used along Florida's east coast, which is best comparison because the Gulf has completely different waves and tides. But yes, both offshore breakwaters as well as nearshore reefs for shore protection and modifying have been used to varying levels of success. So there's some projects that have been constructed and deemed success. There's been other ones that did not meet their design goals, and because of that, they had to be pulled out at the cost of the people that put them in, because that's part of the permit requirement, is if you end up negatively impacting the shoreline based on the monitoring, then you're on the hook to remove it.
Hi. Thank you very much. This presentation is wonderful. We've been talking about the accretion of the sand going back and forth. What would be the best solutions if Volusia has a particular problem with the sands moving laterally?
Right. So the solution here that structural solution that controls lateral movement would be the groins, because what they do is, if I can use the laser without messing things up, cannot. So the sand that moves along the shore, what gets trapped on in this case, most often the north side of the groin, and what that does is can cause a little bit of erosion on the south side of the groin, and that's why they're usually done in a series where it becomes kind of a scallop shoreline. One of the challenges here with groins when they're exposed is it does cause problems with recreation on the beach. Not so much just going out and sitting on it, but running or walking and certainly driving has challenges related to having those structures, because they do back up. Usually they go a little bit even further back than is shown in the drawing there. There we're kind of trying to convey it's buried. So usually they're buried for a certain stretch and then they become exposed. And as the beach is either in more of an accreted or eroded condition, you would see more or less, of that feature.
What I was understanding from the program a year ago was that you would have them in a particular place. But if you've got a long stretch of beach and you've got sand moving up and down, north and south, then wouldn't those just kind of make it more of a problem?
No, that you captured it very well. Typically, these are done in closed systems where either that or at the end of a coastal system, it may be the terminus where you're about to end into an inlet and you're losing a ton of sand at the inlet. Instead of just having a single jetty, sometimes they'll put a series of these, or in, say more like the Caribbean islands and smaller little pocket beaches, you could have these if there's a lot of sand moving along the shore. On a long stretch of open, similar oriented coastline, these would cause likely more problems than they would solve, because they don't provide any storm protection when the waves and storm surge comes in like a breakwater would. They're not going to trip the wave energy, so they're not providing any of that storm benefit. It's all in the name of that longshore, and really the county wants longshore transport. I mean, that's something in a healthy beach system. You're going to have that natural motion of sediment, not only, as you said, across the shore during storms, but along the shore over time. When the waves come in at a little bit of an angle, each sand grain moves up at an angle and then straight back down. So it does that 200 times, it moves, along the shore, which is why we're starting to see some of the Ormond Beach, cinnamon colored sand even down into Daytona and Daytona Beach shores. That's just that natural transport. And we should point out, it does go south to north as well in certain conditions when there's certain weather systems and the waves are coming in at that angle. It doesn't only move in a single direction, it does move in both, but the predominant direction is typically north to south. So yes, that is a good point. These are similar to what I saw in the other ones. For a long stretch on a community-wide solution standpoint, having a growing field is not, it's expensive and it's not going to meet a lot of the goals, which is why when we're almost there, when we get to the evaluation of each of these on the objectives that Wendy's going to get into, they didn't score as high as many of the other solutions.
I've heard about a technology, I don't know the official name, I'll call it electrifying the sand, and I've heard it's been used over in Tampa. I don't know anything about it, but why was it not included in any of your alternatives?
So, so that technology uses a low-level electrical current, and in doing so, it's relatively new, at least to my understanding. In doing so, it causes a chemical reaction really that causes the sand in some of the seawater to solidify and basically make the beach a little bit more erosion resistant. So I am not aware of that being applied on a very large scale, and it also ties back to right now, the county is in such a sand-starved environment that we have high tide water levels reaching up and kissing the seawalls, which is only causing further erosion. So with 37 miles of beach that we're trying to manage, I think I'm honestly curious to see where that technology is going to go in the future. Maybe it could be used in small areas just before a storm. But in terms of a long-term, approach that the county's working towards to manage the 37 miles, these are solutions that can solve that. And getting back to the idea I've mentioned a few times now, the hybrid solution, maybe in the future, as that technology evolves, there'd be a way to implement that in smaller chunks.
So I think you hit all three as I was sitting here.
Oh.
First off, with respect to the entire beach, obviously hybrid approaches may work. I don't know. Some areas like Ponce Inlet where there's no driving, groins may work. But I also know recreationally, it's an obstacle. I know that you talked about other areas along the eastern seaboard that have, say, the artificial reefs or whatnot. Has there been instances reported of boat wreckage or whatever because of that? Has there been issues with groins, people getting hurt? Because we are well visited here, maybe probably more in some areas. And then the last question, I noticed on some of the groins, I saw a presentation a while back, because you just hit it, with the south to north sand direction. Because, in a perfect world, it would just come in from the east to west, but it doesn't. So that being said, a lot of sand compiles on those groins in one area, one property, and then starves the one adjacent to it. And that's a concern as well, correct?
Correct, and that's one reason why they're hard to permit, because you have to prove that you're not going to have a downdrift impact. You could imagine, if homeowners were doing solutions and then they were adversely affecting their neighbors, there'd be a whole bunch of lawsuits and things like that. So seeing around that, every groin field or solution is part of getting your permit. You have to document that you've done the work and have a solution or a mechanism to mitigate any adjacent impacts that you would have. Related to people climbing on the rocks, I remember seeing signs in New Jersey like, stay off the rocks. Now whether people are going to stay off the rocks or not, and if they get up there and slip and fall, whether they're going to, what they're going to do. And then we do have on there as a drawback that navigational hazard to boaters and swimmers. That really depends on how deep they are and how big they are, and then different requirements for either markings or things like that. The reefs are usually low enough to where they're not going to be causing any boats for the ones that would be that close to shore. Yeah.
Something in the ocean, that has nothing to do with the private thing. Wouldn't that be either a county that would have to apply for that?
Correct. If this would be a county application when we're looking at a community scale. Two things I want to bring up based on the discussion, just to be very clear. You can permit anything. But just like if you were building a very large impervious building or structure on a parcel of land and it was full of wetlands, you're going to pay to mitigate for the wetlands impacted. But you could still get there to build it. And if it's not something similar to local government, if it's not something that the regulators have seen, and it's not something that has been proven, then it's going to take longer to permit it. It's going to cost more money to permit it, and they will most likely require you to remove it at your cost should it not do the intended benefits. You can permit anything. There was some groins and some buried walls that were permitted that were required to be removed. I believe it was Martin County is notorious for dumping tires. It may be the wrong county. I think it's Martin County. The bunch of tires that they dumped offshore as a reef, and then they were required to remove all those tires because they floated around everywhere. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Two quick questions. Would the coastline shape of Volusia County not need to be factored into the analysis of your alternatives? And what I mean by that is if you're in Ponce Inlet and you look to the north, you know, Daytona Beach is way out to the east. So the question is, as we're looking at the alternatives for each municipality, would that not need to be factored into their decision? Mother Nature, a lot of times I'll call Jessica and say, Mother Nature's been back at it in Ponce Inlet because our sand is naturally coming back, as you've explained. And I'll ride my bicycle before we started the beach restoration program. I'd ride my bike up to Daytona Beach shores, and I was looking at seawalls and flat sand. And so to me, that needs to be factored in my opinion, to each individual municipality's decision. The last question I have, surfers. Last night at the meeting in Daytona Beach Shores, there was a surfing group there. I don't know if they came up and talked to you or not, but they caught me. And they want to know what's going to be the least impactful structure that we're looking at as far as alternative structures because of the surfing. And again, I don't surf, but it is a big impactful thing we have in Ponce and New Smyrna. Right. So is there anything that would be the least impactful for the surfing organization?
Right. Do you want to go? You go. So the first question, yes, individual community aspects related to either shape or proximity to the inlet, those types of components and features will be considered within the alternatives, or were considered within the alternatives that were selected, and certainly it would be included within the design of the potential solution. So it's not a tailored, there's a one beach nourishment design that's going to be applied all the way up or down the county. There will be site-specific by community and take into things like the sand grains, the beach width, whether there's a dune or not, and aspects like that. So certainly for surfing, anything, the least impactful for surfing would be structure relocation, right? Anything that's done up on the land that doesn't do anything offshore would be the alternatives that don't affect surfing. And stuff that is changing the sediment in the system could have some impact. Now, beach nourishment has been done in areas where there's a fair amount of surfing, and what it does, it just gets, especially here, sand back into the system where it can move naturally back and forth. There will be situations where bars are either there or not there right now. There's a lot of sand moved much further offshore. The most impactful to surfing would be that near shore placement, because in that case, you're just purposely taking large quantities, hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of material potentially and dumping it in that near shore. So that would be the most impactful. And I would say, there's ones that have no impact, but those also don't meet a lot of the goals of the, that the county set.
I will say the 2019 nearshore placement that the Army Corps did in New Smyrna Beach between Sapphire and Crawford created the dredge wedge, which was a local hotspot, and everybody loved it, and only the locals knew about it because they didn't tell anybody until Surfline showed up with it. The two most popular areas for surfing are piers and jetties because it creates wave refraction, and that's what makes the wave. Anytime you have an obstacle in the near shore area, what that does is it forces the wave to pop up, and that's what creates the wave that we want to surf. Volusia is known for surfing. We are the most consistent wave on the East Coast. I think my husband would divorce me if I messed that up. So that surfing is very much in the back of our mind as we try and cater our solutions. What I can say is we're going to be very mindful of what we do on our solutions to not negatively impact the surfing quality and hopefully improve the surfing quality for our shoreline.
And again, you know, great presentation. Sat through it last night. Wonderful. Back for more today. But I think having part of that somewhere in the presentation would go a long way, because that is a pretty big, powerful group out there, and it does generate dollars. And again, like the turtle impact, you know, we have that in there, where environmental impact. So just a suggestion.
Yes, and notably too, to add on to that, sand placement activities, those are natural solutions. So one day sand might be in one spot, there might be a really great wave, and another day it might be gone. So that will ebb and flow with the waves and the local environment. So those are natural solutions that will come and go, just as a wave does now.
Okay.
All right, so moving on, how did we rank these solutions and choose what our preliminary recommendations are for the county? So Chris just went through a lot of background information that we compiled on each one of these alternatives. That included what is its function, what are the benefits and drawbacks associated with it. We also have a section on risk and uncertainty. Each one of these alternatives have different amounts of risk and uncertainty. Some are greater than others. What are social considerations, such as being able to surf, how the community uses the beach? That's very important to take into account. And again, is it feasible at a large scale? We're looking at community-wide solutions. We also took into account design and maintenance needs, permitting. As Jessica said, almost anything's permittable, but it varies as to how easy or difficult it is to permit these solutions, and cost. So we worked with Jessica and her team here at the county to define study objectives to help us rank each one of these alternatives. This includes reducing coastal storm damages to structures, critical infrastructure, and cultural resources. We want to keep those houses safe and those roads safe. Also, to reduce risk of natural resource loss. That is the erosion of sand and the subsequent degradation of habitat as well. Reduce risk to life safety. People need to be safe. Top priority there. Avoid impact to recreation, being able to bike on the beach, walk on the beach, surf, swim. Very important. Minimize impacts to threatened and endangered species and their habitats, the sea turtle nesting habitat, that's huge, so important here, as well as shorebirds and any other marine mammals. And importantly, as Chris mentioned previously, we need to comply with all federal, state, and local policies and regulations. If we can't permit something, even though most things we can permit, but we need to be able to permit it, hopefully in a quick fashion, in order to accomplish anything. So with each one of these alternatives and each one of these objectives, we ranked them either as fully meets objective, partially meets, or does not meet. Again, your eyes are not going bad, but I want to walk you through this table first. Across the top, we have each one of our objectives, and just below that, we have a weighting. These are weighted slightly differently based on some importance levels that we set with the county. On the left side, you have each one of the alternatives, and we assign point values based on whether or not they met the objectives. So fully meets, receive 2 points, partially 1, and does not meet 0 points. We then applied a multi-criteria decision analysis approach, and the maximum score that any alternative could receive is 2 points. So maximum of 2 points. Coming in as our first top-ranked alternative is beach nourishment with 1.85 points. So very close to those 2 points. The only score it did not get fully meets in is minimize impacts to threatened and endangered species and their habitats. This is just a temporary caveat. Construction may have some impacts. Those are all monitored for during construction, and that's all taken into account while permitting. But that's why we didn't rank it as fully meets in that category. It's just a temporary impact, possibly. Next, we have structural relocation coming in at 1.5 points. Close behind that is nearshore sand placement with 1.45 points. And then tied for that fourth ranked position, we have breakwaters and nearshore artificial reefs, two very similar structures with some similar themes and common goals there. And they come in at 1.1 out of 2 points. So just another way to look at this, and we have a poster over on the right if you prefer to visualize this data and these results. These radar plots help depict each solution's contribution to the objective. So a larger area in this plot means that it's more likely to meet the contribution to objectives that we set and their weights. So please check out that poster if you'd like to visualize it for all 10. This is just our top 5 solutions. And that brings me to our preliminary recommended shoreline management alternative strategies by community. On the left side of the table, we have our risk ranking that Chris went over a little bit earlier. So we incorporated that into this final table, followed by each one of the community names and our recommended management alternatives. However, we want to hear from you. We want to hear from your communities. So I encourage you to take the survey, share it with your communities, because we're going to take that feedback into consideration when making our final recommended shoreline management alternatives in our report. You'll see throughout most of the county, we are proposing beach and or dune restoration. Designs for these will vary. What may work in Ormond Beach might not be the design for Daytona or New Smyrna. These designs will vary. They're based on historic conditions. So we look at all that historic data, we set the berm height, different elevations of these designs based on prior conditions. Additionally, as Chris talked about a bunch, maybe a more robust solution that has multiple alternatives is appropriate. However, at this time, we need to get out of this sand-starved system. That's very important. And then maybe a more localized, smaller scale alternative can be implemented in some communities to help if there's erosion hotspots. But right now, these are our preliminary recommendations. And we'd love to hear from the community. So please take that survey and share it far and wide.
Okay, so before we switch over toward looking towards a long-term beach management plan, the survey is going to be open through January. There is no rush for this. We understand that we're coming up on the end of the year, and nothing ever happens at the end of the year anyways, right? We want you to take this home with you. We want you to talk about this within your community, within your professional groups, within your neighborhoods, your churches, your recreational mahjong league. Please run with this. The county will be doing a series of presentations to various stakeholder groups. If you would like for us to come and do the roadshow, we are available. Come see me afterwards. Can you put the ranking back up, and then maybe we can open it back up? And is there any questions on, go back one more, please. The chart. Is there any questions on this one? It's a little technical. It does rank out. Just want to feel the temperature of the room if we should stop or just keep running forward. Okay. All right, let's go. Thank you, ma'am. So, as we look towards a long-term beach management plan, this is what we're doing right now. We have shown you how we have come through, and we have ranked our communities on who is most critical at the moment due to all the risk factors we talked about, how high your property is, where the structure is related to the shoreline, your historical erosion or accretion rate. And I'm super proud of you guys. You're using the word accretion. Nobody knew what that was 3 years ago. You're getting an A on my book. So we've gone through this. We've made a set of recommendations. This is being recorded because this is also what I want to take home. Is I understand people want to lean into these. The surfers want to check into it. The fisherman community wants to check into it. The walkers, the joggers, the drivers, all the people that use our beach. And I wanted to take the opportunity to kind of dive into the intricacies of this. This is a lot to handle in just a 20-minute public presentation. We gloss over a lot of it at that level, but this allows us to dig in and ask those questions and kind of get a little thicker in the weeds on it. Moving forward, we're going to have the survey open through January, maybe longer. I need feedback from you guys. If the cities choose to take a stance on this and they want to hear something, we will extend the survey as long as there seems to be positive motion on community feedback. Ultimately, we got 12,000 surveys from our beach user survey. Clayton Jackson, our public information guy, told me that we get 40,000 responses on SurveyMonkey before we have to level up. I hope we have to level up. We have 191 beach passes registered, 191,000 beach passes registered. I'd love to get 20,000. That's 10%, right? So let's go there. Let's get as many people to hear about this as possible. We will take this on the road show. If you know an agency or group that would be interested, let me know. Once we figure out what our plan is, the next discussion that we're going to have as a community is how do we fund this? So let's talk about money. So there's two different types of projects. There is a federal project where the Army Corps does the work for you and you cost participate with them. There is a state-funded project. You have to have a beach management plan to partner with the state on funding projects. You must have a beach management plan. That's what we're doing right now. We are locking our plan in as a community so that our plan fits every community and every user group. Daytona's priorities are completely different than New Smyrna's priorities, which are completely different than Bethune's priorities and then Ormond by the Sea. We have a vast amount of community users in our neighborhoods. Small projects range about 10 mil. Large projects, $150 million. That's a lot of money, especially when we are in a climate of trying to cut our taxes, go to rollback every year, and then trying to find revenue sources. Couple of ways, historic beach funding mechanisms that exist throughout Florida right now. Beach user fees, we have parking and driving. Other locations use their beach user fees to maintain their beaches. Tourist development tax, the legislature and state statutes actually allow you to use TDT tax in order to fund portions of or all of their beach. A lot of people use the tourist development tax. A local sales tax option, that's another way to fund a project of this size. Flat millage rate. There's a couple of counties in the state of Florida that just have a flat millage rate across the entire county, and that's how they fund their beach programs. And then special service districts. If one community steps up and says, we just want our community to be done and we want to be first in the line and we'll get everybody on board and we want to self-tax ourselves, then you can set up a special service district. And it could be stepped, it could be flat rate. Again, it could be, the guy on the water pays more than the guy on the, west of 95 if you want to go that way. Or maybe you stop at the river. It can kind of be jigsawed out the way that you want to get there. So state-funded projects with the Department of Environmental Protection, and again, you must have a beach management project or plan in order to even be eligible for the funding. They funded us $82 million following the 22 hurricanes because we had 6 million cubic yards of sand loss, and they said, get sand on the beach. The work that she referenced in Wilbur by the Sea Replace the Berm, 100% grant funded. This presentation that we're doing, this beach management plan, again, 100% grant funded. So when you say we're spending a lot of money, we are spending a lot of money, but we are spending the grant funding that was provided in immediate response to the hurricanes Ian and Nicole. So, couple of things to keep in the back of your head as you go towards a state project. Let's say we get through this, we have a beach management plan, and we say, this is our first project, we want to do our first project. State, we're ready, come give me our 50%. They say, that's great, we're happy you came. It's ranked. You got to compete. It's competitive. The state would provide 50%, but it is ranked. And their funding is 100% based off of what the legislature appropriates in their budget. You guys all know this, leadership changes. So historically, and I'll go into the economic impacts of tourism in Florida, but historically our state legislature has recognized the importance of our beaches and has tended to fund our beaches very well. But as you know, leadership changes. What, every 2 years, I think? Maybe more? So let's say we don't rank. Or you get 1 year and you've got a project and the state says, not this year, maybe next year. Well, then you're at risk of either one, self-funding, so you have to find that other 50%, or two, you say, looks good enough, let's try next year. And then you delay the maintenance of your storm protection projects. So if you're already at your interval cycle and you need to go and put gas in the tank and you say, I'll wait till my next paycheck, you never know what storm's around the corner. So you're either going to have to self-fund it or you're going to have to take that risk and say, let's ride it out. Federal projects, federal feasibility study. This is our goal. And the reason why is you've got a better cost participation right there. 65 federal, 35 local, 100% if you get storms. So 2004, last time we had a significant storm event that exposed school buses at Esther Street Park in New Smyrna in the dune system. At that point, we got authorized for federal project. I feel like we're, Schoolhouse Rocks, where you're a bill and you walk to the Capitol and they tell you how to create a bill. There's two ways, you have to have two major things happen before you have the Army Corps come and put sand on your beach. One is you have to be authorized as a project in a bill, a piece of legislation that is approved by Senate and House and signed by the President. We have that. We are an authorized project. We became authorized in 2006. Next thing you need is a funded study. The way you get funded at a federal level is through three ways. First, you show up in the president's budget. And when I say you show up in the president's budget, it says Volusia County Coastal Storm Risk Management Project, 1.5 mil. That's all we need, 1.5 mil in this massive budget that we have. That's one way. The second way is what we all love to call an earmark, where one of our elected officials says, Volusia County is special. We're going to put Volusia County in some legislation somewhere that appropriates money, whether it's a continuing resolution or an appropriations act or something. And again, it has to say Volusia County Coastal Storm Risk Management Project, $1.5 million. So it's clear as mud that we have money coming to us and it's coming to Volusia County and specifically for this project. The other way to do this is through dedicated appropriation acts. So typically your Energy, Water, and Natural Resource Committee or your Transportation Committee are the two committees that fund projects such as this. Again, they only do 5 new projects in those appropriation bills a year. So we're competing, last year we were competing with a wall down by Mexico. A couple of years before that, we were competing with California and their fires. I think we were competing for other things that are of importance in the nation that's taking our paltry $1.5 million and making it fall really far down on the priority list. Yes, I'll leave that at that. So, you hear 333, 3 years to complete, $3 million. The county would pay 1.5 with its split with the state. So we'd basically be at 750. 3 levels of review. And the fun thing about this beach management plan that we're doing, that offshore sand sourcing we talked about earlier, getting the permits to place it all on the beach, that counts as in-kind contribution. So when we do get Volusia County Coastal Storm Risk Management Project, $1.5 million, which is the Fed's portion of the 3, then we can come back and say, well, we already spent all this money doing our plan, doing our risk assessment, doing a shoreline alternative, testing the sand to find our sand source that we can put on there. Oh, and by the way, we have a ton of permits to put sand on the beach already. That counts as in-kind contributions. So by going through this process we're going through right now, the money and the time that we're spending doing this using grant funding will be in kind on our federal feasibility study, and I'm gonna be positive when it's approved. The reality is that once you get a name on a bill that says Volusia County Coastal Storm Risk Management Project, let's say it happens in 2026, that study is not going to be done until 2029. That just identifies the projects. Then we have to get another, let's call it Daytona Beach solution, because we haven't figured out what Daytona's Beach solution is going to be. You then have to go back through that process again and get another appropriation in a legislative bill that says Daytona Beach's solution, $10 million. I'll just throw a number out there. It's probably going to be much more expensive, but $10 million. So then you're going back through that lobbying process at the federal level to get that project named in an appropriated legislation or named in the president's budget. So when the people call 2022, why isn't the Army Corps dredging the offshore reefs like they do or offshore sand sources like they do in New Jersey and pumping it on the beach? Because we don't have any of this in place. We don't have the permits. We don't have the sand sources completed. We don't have our vision. We don't know that Daytona wants us to do that. You may live there. You may have a beautiful house, but that may not be what your community solution ends up being. So this is very important for setting our vision. And I said it last night. I'll say it again. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old daughter. We are very beach oriented. My husband's a huge surfer. I love laying in the sand because there's way too many sharks in New Smyrna. But I want there to be a beach there when my grandchildren are on the beach. That's all of our goals, right? We want this wonderful resource that we live on to be there for future generations. So there's a lot of numbers. I'm going to pick up my paper. The why, not just because Jessica wants to have grandbabies on the beach one day, but last week there was a study published on Surfline. I don't know if you know what Surfline is, but Surfline is a very, it's basically the biggest surfing website there is in the world. You can go on there, you can look at webcams, you can see when the high tides are, you can check the full moons, you can see the winds, the wind direction, the swell direction, all the things. So a recent study published last week on Surfline found that beaches generate $240 billion in annual spending nationwide. $240 billion nationwide. They attract 10 times more visitors than our national parks combined. Historically, as a nation, we've only invested pennies per visit. Fortunately, communities are starting to recognize beaches for what they really are, living infrastructure that protects our coastline and powers our economy. After hurricanes, well-maintained beaches have been shown to reduce property damages by up to 90%, returning $5 or $6 for every dollar invested. Let's see how that plays out in Volusia County. Those numbers I just mentioned, they're not just national trends. They're our reality right here. Dr. James Houston conducted a comprehensive economic impact assessment for Volusia County, and what he found validates what they're seeing across the country. Beach tourism in Volusia County accounts for $4.3 billion annually to our county's GDP. That is 17% of our total economy. When we compare tourism from 21 to 23 against pre-pandemic years of 17 to 19, beach-oriented tourism was 30% higher. I did print off the economic reports for everybody. It is in the back of the table if you want to dig into it. 61 million day trips. So when he goes surfing every day of the year, he's contributing 365 day trips to the beach. That's twice the attendance at our Volusia County beaches than all Florida state parks combined. We have more people visit our beaches a year than all the state parks have combined. Volusia County spending by beach-oriented tourists supports more jobs than any other industry. 31,400 jobs from beach tourism, compared to 13,000 in education, 12,000 in construction, and 10,000 in manufacturing. These beaches generate 31% of our county's annual sales tax revenue. That's about $28,000 per homesteaded property. We're not just talking about protecting sand. We're protecting the foundation of our local economy and the livelihoods of thousands of families in this room and across our county. So remember that beach survey we did for everybody? Of our beach survey, 53% of the people who responded went to the beach every single week. 23% went a month, and 91 respondents agree that the condition of our beach is worse now than it was before the hurricanes. 79% of our tourists said that they were vacationing in the county because of our beach. 97% of all tourists stated that they visited the beaches regardless of their primary purpose for vacationing in the county. The beaches are important not only to our economy, but they're important to our residents. They're important to our health and our wealth and our mental acuity. Going to the beach and getting your mind right, you can solve a lot of problems in your mind. They're not only our recreation, they're also our meditation. So I want to thank you for your time today. I know this has been pretty technical. Thank you for giving us the space and the breath to go into this a little bit deeper. We do have our board set up. Are there any questions that you want to ask while the cameras are rolling? We will also be available afterwards should you have additional questions.
Thank you. I am going to do the white elephant here in the room. I'm sorry, but the amount of money, which we're not even talking about what the potential cost is of the recommended strategy. I personally, I want to be here when the beach gets better. And I take note that your response was about your grandchildren, and you're probably at least 20 or 30 years younger than me. It concerns me to hear about waiting on the feds. I think the unknown is bigger now than perhaps in a historical perspective. So I feel like we are very dependent if we want to improve our situation, which I personally do, and I feel it's necessary. I feel like it's on us as local communities and as the county as a whole, to be looking at how do we make much of this happen, and how do we do this faster than, I'm sitting here thinking about that slide, Jessica, and I'm like, we're in 2030s now, which, every year I'm panicking about the next storm event and the impact. I personally don't feel like waiting till 2030 is reasonable. So I kind of am wondering, and I don't think this is the engineers solving this particular response, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Jessica, but I feel like, how do we as a community get to that piece of responding? Because even if we buy into beach nourishment, all of us, right? Because that looked like the solution across all the, how do we prioritize the where? right? And I'm thinking about, I understand seawalls, but I've seen erosion increase since seawall, right? I understand why we need to do that. But as a recreational user of the beach, I'm concerned about that aspect, and I understand the economic impact. So how do we have what I think is the next conversation, but like super important and urgent?
So we're going through, if you remember in the beginning, we talked about the two projects, the shoal to shores project, where we were getting all the sand that was the 2 million that was in the inlet. That's one high volume amount of sand. We're also doing the offshore sand search. If you want to truck sand in and spend money, we can do that. It's very expensive. You're paying a significant amount of money on the dollar for that. The trap bags are a temporary solution so that people can do their own improvements to protect their own private property from additional structural damage. The offshore sand source investigation will probably take about 2 years to get into that 40 million cubic yards of sand. The priority ranking is going to be based off of two things. Just like infrastructure and roads, the worst road gets paved first. That's why we did the risk analysis on who was at the highest risk based upon the multiple scientific factors. The other question is going to be money. And that's where if there is a community that wants to step to the front of the line and say, we want to be first, then that kind of opens the door to how are we going to fund it? And if they're creative in how to fund it, then that opens the door faster. Even going on the offshore sand, the 40 mil, that's going to be 5 years at a minimum. The fastest route is we're going to spend the 82 that we have. We're going to spend that out. We're going to zero it out. That will probably take us 3 years to get there. The council at that time will have to determine what they will do to proceed after that. We're trying to set the roadmap up for the next 50 with this. This also does provide us priority on who's the worst of the worst, because I don't think anybody's really good except New Smyrna by the jetties. They look great at Menorca. They can sleep well. But yeah, it's going to be a difficult conversation within our individual communities alone, and then at a countywide level on how to make the match. The state program, they will 50% fund design. So if we get through the beach management plan, then we are eligible to ask for 50% funding design. But we're going to spend our $82 billion first and tier it out completely before we go after that grant process.
Thank you. How does prioritizing, or even somebody willing to self-fund a project, let's say, I don't know, Daytona Beach or Shores, said we'll self-fund. What happens to the beach side north and south of them if they're not also being restored at that time?
So let's say they choose to go with the recommendation of beach and dune restoration. Then basically that's a massive influx of sand into the system on the scale of million cubic yards of sand. Everybody adjacent to a beach nourishment project benefits from it because that sand is constantly, like Dr. Bender said, it's zigzagging out. It's going from the nearshore bar to the berm to the nearshore bar, and then it's July and all gets squishy in our driving lanes, and it hopefully ends up by our seawall before a hurricane comes to town. So anybody in that vicinity where you put sand in benefits.
Thank you, Jessica. With the Army Corps of Engineers, as they're always dredging the inlet, as we go through the process, and thank you and your team again for begging the Army Corps not to just dump it offshore as they have in the past. As we go through this process and we wait and they come back potentially for another dredging of the inlet, will they go back to just dumping it offshore, or will we have an opportunity, as you have this time, to convince them, I'm putting you on the spot, to convince them to do a project like we're currently doing now with the stockpile in ponds?
So we are governed by the inlet management plan that requires that we put a certain percentage north and a certain percentage south of the inlet. Councilman White, I will remind you that that would require an easement to allow the Army Corps to place sand on the beach. Just want that in the back of your head. But the Army Corps is actually very satisfied with the way that this project has worked. They have kind of dangled that they would like to do this again. It's a lot cheaper to put the sand on the beach than it is to fight putting a pipe in the near shore. I can remember when they were in New Smyrna in 2019, they were having so much difficulty just locking that pipe into place because of the high wave dynamic that we have. So every time a swell would come in, it would just flap that thing over to the shoreline and have to go reset that guy and put it back out there. Ponce Inlet, New Smyrna, north are very unique. There is a hole in the jetty at what I'll call the groin, even though it's not a groin, it's where the beach meets the jetty. And that caused a lot of sand loss, hyper specifically in South Ponce Inlet. We have a plan in place. We have an application submitted to the Army Corps to extend that concrete jetty deck 400 feet west in the park to the pavilions. What we have found is that the concrete jetty deck that exists there has locked the Army Corps' rocks in place. Where the jetty deck is not, all the rocks have, flim-flammed everywhere. We believe by doing that work, we will help make Ponce Inlet's break better because there'll be more sand in the system. But we also believe it will be a larger recreational beach, and we hope that that dune can grow back that we lost on the southern tip of it. The reason we haven't done that is the Army Corps, if you remember, they were in town a few years ago, I think it was 2021, and they were doing the rocks on the jetty, and they were bringing them in. Everybody saw them, whether you were in New Smyrna at the railroad tracks on Canal or at the slope ramp putting your boat in. They were bringing 2 rocks at a time on the lowboys to put onto the jetty. The contractor got into a contractual dispute with the federal government. I think they finally resolved it. But what we're proposing to do is we're going to work with the Army Corps when the government opens back up. The application's already been submitted. It's been submitted for 3 or 4 months by now. And we want to fix the Ponce Inlet, and you should see an immediate effect on your sand loss north of the inlet once that jetty hole has been fixed. And we believe we have a solid solution that will increase access to the very popular jetty, provide you additional sand in Ponce Inlet, and allow Lighthouse Point Park to accrete and grow further to the ocean.
And to further your comment on the easement agreements, you guys have done a great job. We filled a lot of questions from residents and, or visitors that are coming back and saying, why is the water so dingy and nasty? I said, it's wonderful. It's sand that's being pumped and it's getting back into the ocean, but it's coming back to the shore. So I think educating the public through the council and through the county has been very good. You'll never please everyone, and we try. And I do lose some sleep over it sometimes because of some phone calls that I get, but trying to convince everyone it's the right thing to do. Your comment about the extending the concrete walkover, it's amazing. We walk it every morning, and the sand that is now being caught behind where the wooden walkover went away, it's incredible. And they're having to scoop it out, shovel it out every day. So we're fortunate. Then the last piece, it's funny because when the Army Corps was taking the sand and dumping it offshore, I could see residents going out there and waving at the ship, trying to get them to dump it behind their house. And it's the honest to God truth. And Ponce Inlet residents feel that if it benefits everyone, including Ponce Inlet, I think we'll be good on the easement agreements. And Jane, I don't mind going back and re-upping that again, as long as it continues to go the way it's going right now. The only complaint we have is where they pull the big dredge and moved over to the West Coast. We could have been completed by now. And I understand the money factor for them, but if both dredges had stayed in place, this project would have been completed. So if we can find a way to tighten that up next time, I think the selling factor to the residents to get them to sign the easement agreements will be fine.
The other benefit about not, so it's always better when you spend somebody else's money, right? That's how you get rich. You spend someone else's money to do something. But when you partner with the state, then the county will hold the construction contract. Where with the Army Corps' stockpile area, we do not hold that contract, so we can't interpret our own contract terms and we can't enforce our interpretation of contract terms. Where if the county holds the contract, we have leverage and we can work with them and we can get to making it right, which is why we're doing the sand hauling, is we will get to making it right. There is a benefit to partnering with the state that you do have more control contractually over your end product and the level of service you get during construction.
Earlier today, you mentioned something about the temporary versus the permanent easements. I remember after Nicole, people would say, I don't want that on my property forever, or I'm planning to sell, blah, blah. So could you tell us more about the temporaries? For my area, it might make it easier to get them.
So the temporary easement, we did it twofold. One, we did it so that we could come in immediately after Hurricane Nicole and do debris removal at a public scale that was reimbursed by FEMA. So it allowed us to come in and take broken seawalls and washed up debris that could have been determined as private, but it allowed us to do it under a public nature. And it also allowed us to put trap bags in place where we needed to put trap bags. That easement allowed us to do that. And then we knew we had sand projects coming. So if we're gonna put trap bags in place, then we're gonna have to pull the trap bags out. It's in part of our permit and it's in our easement that the trap bags are coming out. We knew we were gonna put sand in as well. The temporary easements that we signed, and it's based upon the sign date, it was a 5-year long easement. When we get to the design and the solution that my grandchildren will be playing with and surfing on, those will have to be long duration easements, maybe perpetual. The Army Corps requires 50-year. But what that also does as a property owner is if I were looking to sell my property, I'd be like, look, I've got an easement. It allows the county or the federal government to come in every X number of years and maintain this erosion solution that's behind my house. And you should probably talk to Miss Miller or Mayor Miller, because what a lot of the condos found out was that the seawalls that failed or their pool decks that collapsed were not covered by their insurance. So they had to self-fund and self-assess the repairs and the replacement. Some of the condominiums in the shores, I can tell you, spent $3 million on one wall. That doesn't count the concrete spalling they've got on there, the regular maintenance that has to go on to structures that live right adjacent to the ocean. So there's a little bit more protection as a property owner that you have another solution in place and you don't have to hope that your seawall is good. As Dr. Bender said, the seawall should be the last line of protection, not your first.
My understanding is that there is a minimum environmental standard currently on the books about dune construction in front of seawalls, but that has been waived after the storm event for Ian. Given the short versus long-term aspect of all this improvement, would requiring dunes in front of whether it's a revetment or a seawall, would that be a positive for the beach? And I'm thinking about the whole next door neighbor thing.
So, and Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, the dunes in front of seawalls were waived and were not required by DEP. The dunes on top of rock revetments were required by DEP. That requirement has not been waived. And the reason for that is they want to make sure there's 3 feet of sand on top of the rocks so that the turtles could successfully nest and the clutch could be viable. There's a financial burden on the rocks. So while you have a seawall and you may spend a larger amount of money up front building a seawall structure, and the county waived that requirement in light of the significant damage across the coastline and the fact that we got $82 million to put sand on the beach, the people who put the rocks in are going to be required to place the sand in perpetuity. So that could be the tune of maybe $20,000 a year. I'm just averaging out what a potential single parcel might look like. There's a significant maintenance cost that comes along with the rocks already. It's, you know, if you eat lettuce for lunch, but you go and have a burger with cheese on it for dinner, the lettuce doesn't really do you much good if you look at your health overall. So making one parcel maintain sand in front of their seawall, because you can't retroact it. It's got to be new things coming forward. Making one brand new seawall that, let's just say it's a single family property and it's only 100 feet wide, making them keep sand in front of their dunes, not really going to be sustainable because nobody next to them has sand. So it's just going to go to their property and they're slowly drip dropping sand onto the beach to get lost in the system. So at that level, to make a difference, it has to be a community solution where the dune is done from maybe 3 blocks of land at one time.
And I'll just add real quick from the engineering side of it, the length that beach nourishment project will be projected to last is related to the length, and it's not linear. So there's much more bang for the buck of doing one really, relatively long project, a couple miles or a mile, than to do, many little small projects that are all going to evaporate relatively quickly. So it gets to the idea of community planning versus individual parcel planning. So the idea of any more sand in the system is better than less. So, having it in, but for the most bang for the buck from a community standpoint, instead of smaller dune projects in front of the seawalls, would be how can we get meaningful projects that are going to last a lot longer, that ultimately would be less expensive than many shorter lasting small projects.
One of the slides had a 50-year timeline on the bottom of it. So is that 50 years, like from this point till the end of construction?
The designs that they create are...
That one there, 50-year project commitment. So
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
like from today to the end of construction is approximately 50 years?
No, ma'am. From the start of construction to then it's 50 years is the design level they plan for, with intervals of maintenance.
Okay, so, and with integrals of maintenance, all right, so the funding that you show up there, would that include funding to cover the maintenance that has to go on?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so it's not on the burden of the municipalities to cover the maintenance when all that construction is completed.
And if it's a FEMA project, if it's a Hurricane Ian, typically it's 100%.
Good.
So you do your maintenance when the storm hits, because there's always going to be a storm.
So the Army Corps uses what's called a 50-year project life. So when they're looking at the design conditions, but also the benefits and costs associated with that design, they amortize the costs out on a 50-year plan, and it's a 50-year design life. So over that period, if it's a 5-year or a 10-year renourishment interval, then they're planning for 5 projects in that 50-year period, and costing all that out and figuring out if it's in the federal government's interest, the way they do national economic development costs, when they compare how much storm protection is it providing versus how much it's going to cost. So that's where that another basis of where that 50-year part comes in.
I can tell you one thing that does set us above everybody else, and I will say it loud and I will say it proud in the entire nation, is that we have the world's most accessible beach. We don't have one portion of our coastline that is privatized and you are not allowed to walk on it or run on it or recreate on it. That ranks very high when it comes to federal return on investment. So along with our economic demographics, along with our tourism, And then the public access that we have that is routine and consistent along our coastline really sets us above everybody else. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Tell a neighbor, tell a friend. And we're always here. Thank you.